All right, we will go ahead and welcome everyone today and call the meeting to order. This is December 1st, 2020, and we do have a quorum of the Planning Commission present. Hello, Warren. Welcome. And so we will call the meeting to order, and we're turning it over to Mr. Brecken.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, guys, for everybody for coming by today and taking time out. Today's designed actually to be informal. It is a public meeting, but we want it to be as informal. We're going to share some information. David and Matthew are going to share some information regarding the overview of Planning Commission process and the legislative framework around that process. This is the first of 3 meetings. We'll have another meeting next week that will also talk about future land use and public infrastructure. The meeting after that, to follow that meeting, will be a meeting regarding sewer allocation and sewer ordinance. These meetings have been designed for a refresher for many of you, but also for us to also come back and center. We talked about in Planning Commission a couple different times. We heard the term, we have some unique opportunities coming before us, some decisions to make moving forward, and information shared amongst this team who's a part of those decisions. We think that would be good just to bring us together as a unit to start discussing some of those things, and then update the Planning Commission and other staff members from other departments as to how this process actually happens. If I could get everybody real quickly just to introduce themselves and share what part of the team they play, so that we know who is we're partnering with and who we're sharing this opportunity with today. Let's start with Roman.
Sure. My name is Roman Hankins. I'm an assistant city attorney, and along with David, we work on a lot of the real estate planning for the department, and just try to keep it between the lines.
We'll just come across and just weave our way back.
I'm Ryan Martin. I'm Planning Commission as well as work for City Council.
Greg McKnight, the newest member of the planning process, Director of Planning.
I'm Warren Russell, member of the Planning Commission. I'm trying to see the lines.
David Ives, Deputy City Attorney. Has been working with the Planning Commission and BZA for a few years.
Matthew Blomley, Assistant Planning Director. And enjoy working with all the planning commissioners and the staff.
My name is Brett Bobby, and I'm a planner in the planning department. Charles Ware, staff planner.
Austin Cooper, planner.
Good.
Ken Halliburton, Planning Commission and BCA.
Sean Rock, Planning Commission, working with City Council.
Maria Rush, Fiscal Planner. Kathy Jones, Planning Commission.
Marshall Fall, project engineer with Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department. Mike Thurman, public information.
Amelia Kerr, City of Murfreesboro Planner.
Carolyn Jacob, Planning Department. We have plenty of drinks in the coolers on each side, so be sure and get you something to drink if you need it. Snacks are over here. You can just snack. Cindy Heck, I work with Murfreesboro Water Resources Department. Jennifer Garland, Planning Commission. Katie Knoll, the project engineer in the planning work.
And I'm Marlene Green, Control Planner, almost 2 years.
Good. Thank you, guys. So what David and Matthew will present, share the information. At the end of that, we will take any questions and then open the discussion and dialogue after the presentation so we can make sure we get through the information. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome. I do want this to be informal. I hope that it's informative to everybody. Many of you I know are going to be aware of most of what we're going to talk about. And it may be quite new to some people, and that's all right. We want to get you started. Probably half of the slides I have here could be at least a full hour seminar on that. So we're not going to be going in depth to all the details and all the backgrounds, but this will be much more of an overview. And at the same time, I do want to encourage, we've got enough notes here that I'm not going to get lost, I don't think, or Matthew, I don't think. So if you have a question, put your hand up, some discussion along the way will be probably far better than y'all just listening to me talk. With that, not sure how, I thought this was big enough, it may not be big enough for you to really read, but I believe it was the Cheshire Cat that told Alice, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So we're trying to know where we're going in this process with the community and a lot of effort from a lot of people. We have a general plan in place and we try to move toward that. As you all know, it gets shifted and modified almost daily as we go. But yet we have an end in sight, we have a goal, and so hopefully the road we're going to be on, although it may zig and zag a little bit, will generally be headed toward that goal. An overarching goal is to make this Murfreesboro a great city to live in, better than it is today, and for all of our participants, residents, including city staff and city officials. Overall function of the Planning Commission is to coordinate the orderly development of the physical environment. The opposite of that is a haphazard. Anything can go any place. You can have a pig farm next to somebody's living room. Most of us think that's not a good idea. We would like to have more order in the development and have it make sense as it moves forward. And we're not going to be perfect in that, and there's always going to be someone who disagrees, but hopefully we will have a sense of order for most people as we go forward. Now, I do want to mention one other thing. Most of the time when you see city staff making a presentation like this, they have on a sport coat and tie, or at least a coat. I decided to go the Lamar Alexander route, and maybe yet there's a chance for me to get to be governor. Anyway, back to this. Who are the participants in the planning process? So obviously, to some extent, it starts with the Planning Commission, but Planning Commission, City Council certainly is a big participant. The BZA is a participant in it, and all of city staff. And who else? One more ingredient that goes into that.
Public.
Right, the public. And the public's a big part of that. They should be bigger. We try hard to get a lot of public participation in a lot of our planning efforts and planning work. It seems like the most participation you get is when someone feels or some group of people feel that their particular rights are being interfered with somehow or transgressed. That gets people out generally, but it's difficult to get the public out, and yet the public is a very important part of the planning process, and not just when it makes somebody mad or hurts somebody's feelings or they feel it's going to damage their property values or flood them out. But it's an important process for the whole process, and so when we're making plans as opposed to implementing plans too, we try to get public involvement. We advertise and do the most we can for that. 4 major functions of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is required to adopt a general plan. The Planning Commission adopts that. And Matthew will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but the council can adopt a general plan, but ours does not. Our council, generally, we would have the council approve it. We want council buy-in because they're the ones with the checkbook. All the great plans in the world aren't going to be of much value if the person writing the check is not on board. But yet we do not have council actually adopt the general plan. That is a function of the Planning Commission. Planning Commission is also responsible substantially entirely for the subdivision of land. And what is a subdivision? Basically 2 things. Breaking a piece of property into lots of 5 acres or less. So if you got a farm 100 acres out of town and you cut it into 250s, unless you have to get a new road or new utilities to serve one of those parcels, that's not a subdivision of land. We don't have many of those inside the city, so inside the city, almost any breaking up of a piece of land into 2 or more pieces will be a subdivision. We have a few lots that are big enough that possibly could be divided without it being technically, legally a subdivision. But the subdivision of land, which is a process of making plats and plans and site plans and all of that, that is the function of the Planning Commission. Third thing the Planning Commission is involved in is zoning. So Planning Commission, a number of years ago, adopted a new zoning ordinance, roughly in 1984. They threw out the entirety of the old zoning ordinance, adopted a new one. The Planning Commission was deeply involved in that, but as a recommending body. So the Planning Commission is involved in studying that and making recommendation to council. Council actually adopts the zoning ordinances. And it's the same when we have a particular acreage along Southeast Broad Street that someone wants to change from a single-family residential into a planned residential development or a commercial, maybe change it to highway commercial. That is part of the zoning process. Planning Commission is a recommending body. It's not your final decision, but you're tasked to study it and make a recommendation to council. And then the fourth one is the annexation of land. Annexation is pretty much the way a city grows in size. And again, Planning Commission studies and makes a recommendation to City Council. City Council has the decision whether to annex or not. There are your actions are divided generally into two categories. There is a legislative category and an administrative category. And I've forgotten exactly, okay, yeah. On a legislative category, you're making policy decisions that affect much or all of the community. So for example, adopting the general plan that we worked on for several years and included, we got the Murfreesboro 2035 plan is about that thick. Adopting that general plan is a legislative function because you're doing something that affects the community as a whole. Adopting the zoning ordinance was a legislative function. Even though you're a recommending body in that, it's still a legislative function. The same as if we have what's recently before Planning Commission to make a change in the sign ordinance, which is a subset of the zoning ordinance as a practical matter, even though it's in a separate document. Again, you study and recommend. The reason that's important to distinguish is that when you're making a legislative action or you're in a legislative function, the public has a right to contact you. You are a public servant. They have the right to contact you at the hearing or before the hearing or outside the hearing. The right to call you, write you. Now, you don't absolutely have to talk to someone who calls you, but they have the right to contact you and express their views even outside of the meeting. In the administrative, which is also sometimes called judicial, you're looking at a specific question and you're deciding a specific issue. So, for instance, considering a preliminary plat or a final plat for a piece of property, that's an administrative. We have a set of requirements, and your decision as Planning Commission is, does it meet these requirements or does it not? We're looking at a site plan, and this would digress a minute, an appeal to the BZA, which we'll talk about only briefly in another minute, but an appeal to the BZA is almost always going to be an administrative matter. In an administrative matter, you are to decide that matter on the record before you. So it's not appropriate, and the BZA may be a better example than a site plan, but it's not appropriate for a BZA member to talk to someone from the public, no matter what their interest is, outside the meeting. It happens. Sometimes you can't cut people off, and you don't want to be rude, but you, as when you're in the administrative function, you need to be careful with that, because that decision should be on the record in front of you. Said another way, you as the BZA member or planning commissioner should not consider any matter that's outside that record, which we talk about as an ex parte communication. And to make that make sense, think of it in a litigation context. For me as a lawyer in court, It is almost always inappropriate for me to try to talk to the judge about this case when my opponent's not present. So it needs to be on the record with everybody informed. Matthew, I think we jump over to you. Clicker here.
Got it. There's your glasses.
Oh, yeah, get those out of your way.
Good afternoon, everybody. All right. So as David mentioned, today's meeting isn't meant to be a deep dive into these topics. We're just kind of hitting the surface. It's more of a refresher, a reminder, because many times we get into the nuts and bolts of what we do at every meeting. We get the specific applications, and every once in a while it's just a good idea to have a little bit of a refresher about the basis for why we have these processes and the framework for why we have these processes. And I think one thing to keep in mind, and that's very important, and that's one thing that David's reminding us today, is that most all of these processes, with just a few exceptions, are processes that state law, the Tennessee Code Annotated, gives us specific authority to go through these processes that we have. So you'll see in the slideshow it says that state law says that the city council, which is our legislative body, may create a planning commission. And as you know, because several of you in the audience today sit on the planning commission, Murfreesboro has done this. If it does, the planning commission has a duty to create and adopt a general plan. The general plan is what Tennessee Code Annotated refers to, what we often refer to as a comprehensive plan, but state law refers to it as a general plan. And some of you may remember back in 2017 when we were in the process of reviewing and adopting the Murfreesboro 2035 plan, we had some outdated language in our zoning ordinance, and we had to update the section of the zoning ordinance dealing with the adoption and purpose of the general plan. And so what we did, we took the latest version of the Tennessee Code Annotated and we mirrored the zoning ordinance section on the general plan with state law. Murfreesboro has had several, and the most recent is the 2035 plan, which was adopted by you, the Planning Commission, in 2017, July 2017, I believe. There are a number of elements, and I'd like to hand something out. And this is from Tennessee Code. This is just a list of things, and this is just, I thought you might find it interesting. It's a list of things that is to be included in the general plan, and it's not an exhaustive list. Of course, there can be numerous things that can be included in the general plan, but I thought you might like to see how state law describes the general plan. Two important elements of that are what we refer to as the Major Transportation Plan, which was adopted, I believe, also in 2017. It's in good shape, and we use it on a regular basis as staff to advise folks that come into our office of how their projects will be impacted by future and proposed roadway plans. And then there's also the future land use map of the comprehensive plan. As many of you know, and I think it's kind of undisputed at this point, there are some improvements and opportunities with regards to our current future land use map. And council approved monies for the planning department to work with Reagan Smith and Associates on an update to the future land use map. And that's in process right now. we're looking at a number of things, and I believe that in a future session, we'll touch more on our future land use map update, but we're working on a number of things, including the areas that our economic development consultant has identified as important areas that we need to plan for. The Planning Commission must hold a public hearing before the adoption of the general plan. And it's a little bit different from the adoption of a zoning ordinance amendment or a zoning map amendment. There's actually a 30-day period, a 30-day advertisement period for the legal notice. And one thing that I do want to reinforce is that the comprehensive plan is a plan for the community, and so it's a collaborative effort. And so typically, while state law, yes, does require a public hearing, there are also other opportunities that we always take to reach out to the public and get their input during the process. So as David mentioned, the council, state law gives the local legislative body, in this case the city council, the ability to adopt the future land use plan, or the general plan. Ours has not. If the city council does adopt the general plan, the main difference between the Planning Commission adopting it and the City Council adopting it is that future land use decisions such as rezoning requests and annexations must be consistent with the comprehensive plan if the council adopts. So when the Planning Commission adopts it, it's an advisory document. Mandatory compliance is not required. Now, with that being said, it's always advisable to, even if it is just an advisory document, to keep it up to date and to, if there are decisions that run counter to the map, that the map and or the plan be adopted to take into account those decisions that run counter to the map. And so the city may also adopt sub-area plans, and so the airport master plan is an example, the North Island Avenue study, the historic bottoms planning study, those are examples of sub-area plans. State law requires that we treat those as we would a general plan for the entire city. The same legal notice requirements apply, and once again, if Planning Commission adopts those sub-area plans, which typically that's what we've done in the past, then compliance with those, such as with the North Highland or their historic bottom studies, is not mandatory. If the Planning Commission adopts. If Council adopts, it is mandatory. So with regard to subdividing land, in general, the Planning Commission has final approval of the subdivision of land. And state law indicates that the Planning Commission shall adopt subdivision regulations, and they have the effect of an ordinance. So when someone comes into our office and wants to talk about subdividing their land or developing a new subdivision, the subdivision regulations is the document that we point to that is the guiding document for how they are to proceed in moving forward with their plans for subdividing land. Our latest version was adopted by the Planning Commission in July 2009, and that was after we updated it, after it was, and I'm going to look to David or Margaret Ann, I think it was probably the late 80s, I think, when the previous version was adopted, mid to late 80s, I would think. So it was, they're nodding, so it was much overdue. As David has noted in the PowerPoint, probably ready for a review of those subdivision regulations in the near future. And as a...
I'll add the engineering department is reviewing the street specifications currently for some updates.
And Katie mentioned the standard street specifications. That is an element of the subdivision regulations. It's a separate document, but it is an element of the subdivision regulations. And it's more of an engineering document with specifications on roadway construction. And that document goes through the same process for adoption as the subregs do because it is a part of the subregs. Thank you, Katie. So, as I mentioned, there are the majority of the subdivision of land goes through the Planning Commission for final approval. State law gives city staff the ability to approve very, very minor subdivisions, like if it's a shift in a lot line, or if it's just for the recording of easements, if it's for 2 lots or less, then in those instances, those plats can be approved administratively. But anything other than that requires Planning Commission approval. So what is a subdivision? Now, David mentioned there are some things that don't actually qualify as a subdivision for either administrative approval or Planning Commission approval. And so any division less than 5 acres, if for future sale or building, is a subdivision. So if any of the resulting lots that are being created by a division of land results in a parcel or a lot of less than 5 acres, then that is a subdivision of land. Or any division of land which requires public infrastructure construction, whether that's a new street or utility construction, that is a subdivision of land, even if the resulting parcels are greater than 5 acres. But one of the things that you may have seen, especially those of you who are in real estate, that you may have seen, I look in the Sunday real estate section sometimes, and it says 4 5-acre tracts for sale. And are they actual recorded lots of record? Oftentimes, these 5-acre tracts that you see, and I've seen some that are 5.01. I guess the surveyors do that 0.01 just for good measure. But those are situations where, and most of those situations happen in the unincorporated county, where it's a large parcel along an existing roadway, and they're able to carve it up into 5-acre tracts without building any roads or constructing any utilities. And so that's technically not a subdivision of land. Our particular process, and this is outlined in our subdivision regulations. It is exhilarating reading if you have an opportunity. The first is the master planning process. And what the subregs say is that if you have a subdivision that is going to be divided into multiple sections, then you must submit a master plan. Also, everything in the gateway is required to be master planned. If it's a one-section subdivision, or if it's not going to be developed into multiple sections in the future, then no master plan is required, and you can go straight to preliminary plat. Now, the master plan, the primary purpose of the master plan is to determine global type issues, such as roadway layout, street connections, tying into existing streets that may stub into the property. So you're looking at global issues. We're not looking, when we have a master plan submitted before us, we're not looking, does lot 845 meet the minimum lot width? We're not drilling down that deep into the details. But on the next step, we are drilling in deeper into the details, which is the preliminary plat. The preliminary plat is meant to show us the public infrastructure that's required to serve the lots that are proposed by this subdivision of land. And so here what we're looking at is the design of the roadway infrastructure, the drainage infrastructure, the water, sewer, gas, electricity, telecom, and some of those items are not always what you see on the preliminary plats, because certain utilities actually have independent reviews of those items. The water and sewer that is in the city's jurisdiction, those are shown on our preliminary plats. But what we're looking at are our public infrastructure improvements. And at this point, we also get our first opportunity to see the proposed division of land to make sure the lots meet our minimum requirements. The next step after preliminary plat review and approval by the Planning Commission is submitting to Ms. Knoll in the back for construction plan review. And Ms. Knoll, what percentage would you say that preliminary plats are relative to, if construction plans are 100%, what would you say the standard preliminary plat is?
Probably 85 to 90.
So when we get to the construction plan stage, we're drilling down as deep as we get to make sure that the design of those, of the public infrastructure improvements are compliant with our minimum standards. And not only that, but are compliant with good design principles. Finally, after construction plans have been approved, and sometimes the final plat can actually go to the Planning Commission before construction plans have been approved. Sometimes we see the final plat submitted simultaneously with the preliminary plat. But the final plat is the document that actually gets recorded and creates the lots that are going to be sold and built upon. And so it's a document to record lot lines, public rights-of-way, and easements. Once again, in the vast majority of instances, those final plats must be approved by the Planning Commission. Now, state law does not really give us any authority on site plan approval. A lot of what y'all see are site plans for review. That's something that the authority is given to us by our zoning ordinance. We have a section in our zoning ordinance dealing specifically with site plan review and approval. And as you know, a couple of years ago, we actually modified that section of the zoning ordinance to give or to allow for a greater, or to allow for administrative review on more site plans to help kind of expedite the process and keep the site plans that are going to the Planning Commission relegated to plans of certain characteristics and those that it's decided that there is a need for the public health, safety, and welfare for the Planning Commission to review a given site plan. So Planning Commission must approve a subdivision final plat before it can be recorded, and there's a 60-day time limit from the date the Planning Commission first considers it. So unless you have the blessing of the applicant, you can't defer a site or a plat for greater than 60 days. And we as staff have 30 days from the time that we get the plat in our office, from the time that we accept it, to bring it to the Planning Commission for review and approval. Grounds for disapproval, for those that you may choose to disapprove, must be stated in the record. And failure to approve is not disapproval, but sometimes failure to approve or failure to act may result in the approval of the plan. Now I will kick it back over to Mr. Odd. And I will say I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Do they have any questions for Matthew?
And we'll have questions and answers at the end of the session as well.
So again, I want to go back to the legislative, and administrative division and discussion here on the subdivision of land. Again, a legislative function related to subdivision is adopting the subregs. A few years ago, when we created the gateway overlay areas, we adopted specific gateway design guidelines. Those are general guidelines. They apply to all the land in the gateway, and there's differences among the various gateway areas, but there's still gateway design. That's basically a legislative function. We then, a couple years ago, maybe more than that by now, time flies, adopted general design guidelines applicable for the entire city. They're not as high a standard as we adopted in the gateway, but we're still on that road of trying to improve the quality and the appearance and the overall desirability of Murfreesboro. and the procedure that was adopted in as part of the zoning ordinance for site plan review. That's a legislative function. Reviewing the preliminary plat, as I said, is administrative. Reviewing the final plat is administrative. Reviewing the site plan. Again, these are situations where there is a set of criteria, and if they meet the criteria, they're entitled to be improved. Generally, there's a few areas where preference can go into it, but as a practical matter, we've set out standards, and the question before Planning Commission or sometimes BZA, does it meet these standards or not? If it meets the standards, then they're entitled to be approved. What did I do? Go the wrong way? It helps if you turn this up the right way. Annexation. Again, that's a fundamental component of how the city grows. Planning Commission's role is to study proposals and make recommendations to council. This was in the past often very complicated and incredibly contentious. That was when we as a city had the ability to force an annexation. We could annex by ordinance to some extent at least, whether you as the property owner liked it or not. We tried to not force annexation, generally speaking, but we did at times, especially if we had something coming in, and we might force the annexation to keep it contiguous of an intervening parcel that didn't want to be annexed. That also led to some litigation, some of which we won, a major one of which we lost because we did not have the case resolved by the time state law changed. Now it's really a much more simple process because as a practical matter, we can't annex it unless you, the landowner, want to be annexed, or at least consent to be annexed. So annexations are fairly simple today. Landowner comes in, says, I want to be annexed, or developer comes in and says, I have a contract to purchase this land and I want it to be annexed. We go through the process, and there's a neighbor who might not want his land to be annexed has no standing at that point to complain that your land is being annexed because we're not impacting him. So it's a simpler process. Some think it's a lot better. Some of us think that the ability to force an annexation was a good thing, but regardless, it's not there today, and I seriously doubt if it will ever come back. But who knows what's going to happen in 5 or 20 years in the legislature. Generally, land must be contiguous to be annexed. But contiguous to what? Here we go. One of the big holes in the city of Murfreesboro right now, sorry, somebody may not be able to see this, is this area here. This is the area that was in litigation. Joseph Adelon had referred to it as the nuclear annexation, and it was. And it was in litigation that was not resolved when and I don't remember now what year it was, but when the statute changed that did not allow anything that hadn't been annexed, completely annexed prior to that date, was gone. And so that took out our annexation of all of this area. Some of these areas we don't ever want to annex. Like, I don't know that we would want to annex the battlefield. It's a national park. They take care of themselves. I don't know that we would want to be obligated to provide city services to the national park. The problem, now, as I said, contiguous to what? You might think that this picking up here close to Smyrna is not contiguous. But it is because we annexed the right-of-way and a few feet each side of the road coming up here. At that time we could do that. We still can do that. So that's a contiguous annexation. Today, we could, I'm not sure we ever want to, but we could, just as a for instance, go up and annex this piece of land and nothing else leading to it. We'd have to have an agreement with the county in terms of who handles what part of the roads and the other public infrastructure, because obviously now you've got city garbage trucks and all of that driving up and down county roads just to get to another part of the city. So we'd have to have some specific agreements worked out with the county. The biggest problem of the non-contiguous annexation and the biggest problem of something like this is confusion in delivery of services. And the confusion is in emergency services. So when a 911 call comes in for a little place like this, our computers know where that is. But the translation between the person calling, the 911 operator, the computer they're working with, the computer that the deputy sheriff or city policeman sees that comes into his car, is not always perfect. And when you have confusion in the delivery of those kinds of public services, you have public safety issues, you have people get hurt, you have people get hurt worse than they should have been hurt if somebody would have been there promptly. So the big part of that, the big issue, and at least to me and I think to a lot of people, is the difficulty of providing a clear aspect of who's responsible for that, the house that catches on fire. Is that a city fire truck question, or is that a county fire department question? Now, we have some mutual aid. We help each other out to some extent at least, but it still can be a big concern. And there's another concern for other rolling services. You know, do we want to have to send a city trash truck 2 miles out into the country or more, where there's no city in between, but drive out there that 2 miles to collect a few trash cans and then come back? It adds a significant amount of cost to the services. That's not necessarily a good thing. Again, though, before the, I think I went backwards, or I went too far ahead.
We went backwards. Keep going.
I was holding this thing tight like I really enjoyed it or something. No, I wasn't this far ahead, was I? Matthew, do you remember where?
I think you're on 13.
13, okay. Well, boy, that's fast. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Another aspect of how there was a concept of islands. And the theory of islands was never addressed by the legislature in the past, but our Supreme Court said that leaving an island of unannexed county surrounded by the city was bad planning, and it led to the difficulty in providing services, and it shouldn't be done. I think most cities took that as you can't have islands. One of our answers to that was the creation of 50-foot or 20-foot strips of land, so that technically you didn't have an island. You had a peninsula that was almost an island, but technically it wasn't an island because it wasn't completely surrounded. That was never tested in court, and I think we're lucky it wasn't. But when the legislature a couple of sessions ago said it's okay to go out into the county and annex an island of city surrounded by county, which to some extent Murfreesboro is an island of city surrounded by the county. But when they specifically allowed that statewide, our interpretation of that was that islands they're no longer prohibited. And as we have moved through a variety of things, we have eliminated a number of those 10-foot strips. So we have created real islands, if you will. But in my opinion, those were practically islands in any event. Again, though, the function here is to study and make a recommendation. Talk a little bit about the urban growth boundary. That's this map here. This was a function of the city of Murfreesboro, all the cities actually in Rutherford County, Smyrna, Laverne, Eagleville, and the county to try to decide, again, it's called the urban growth boundary. It should probably be called, and I credit Sam with this, it should be called the municipal growth boundary. Because the practical matter, nobody, at least in Rutherford County, there was no prohibition of urban growth outside of an urban growth area. So now you can't see it on this map, it's too small. But there are a number of subdivisions out here, some small, some pretty good size, that are about as urban as they can get. But they're in the unincorporated county, and always will be. The odds of any of the cities growing out that far is, well, I guess I don't want to say impossible, because certainly in my lifetime, it's not going to happen. And I doubt it in any of yours. 100 years from now, who knows what's going to happen? No, probably a lot of different things. But the urban growth boundaries or municipal growth boundaries, so as a matter of state law, Murfreesboro we've got dark yellow here, that's the incorporated city at this point. There is a lot of acres of unincorporated land that legally this city could grow into and incorporate. How much of it will happen over the reasonably near future is anybody's guess. Question? Okay. Like I said, it was to try to separate urban growth from rural areas. I don't think it's been very successful at that. Legally, there's a process. We could change if anybody could change those boundaries. As a practical matter, it's so complicated with so many political questions involved, I can't imagine it ever happening. Matthew, I guess you're back up to talk about another function of annexation.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank you, sir.
try not to squeeze it and hold it like that.
I'm still waiting for the discussion on creating an archipelago of city surrounded by county.
Yeah.
But hopefully David will touch on that later. So before annexing, council must adopt a plan of services. And so this is something that is specified in state law, and there's a very specific process and specific requirements for the plan of services. So that's why you see this document come before you every time that we have an annexation, because what we're looking at, as David mentioned, it's a policy decision. Should we take a piece of property into our jurisdiction, and can we serve it? Because in theory you might say, yeah, take it in, but we want to provide the Planning Commission the information that they need to make a decision, and the City Council to make a decision on whether or not it's logistically feasible to even annex a piece of property. Because there's an expectation, and state law creates that expectation, that when we annex a piece of property, we need to provide services to that property. And so our plan of services, while it can include information about proposed development, the plan of services is, can we serve that property in its present state? Can we bring it to the city and provide services in its present state? So state law specifies what areas of service that we have to provide information on. And so when y'all get these plans of services in your agenda packets, all of those areas, or most of them, we add some additional detail in the plan of services just for your reading pleasure. But all of those areas like police service, fire service, all the various utilities, solid waste service, those are things that state law spells out that we must provide you information on, and that you must act on, and the City Council must act on when reviewing an annexation. So it's land as it exists today, not as developed in the future, includes the scope and timing of implementation of municipal services. And for annexations and for their plans of services, the Planning Commission studies and makes recommendations on those annexation and the plans of services. So if we are in default of a plan of service, or default on a plan of services, we are limited as to future annexations. And so this is why we do and why we bring to the city council. It's not necessarily something that the planning commission sees, but that the city council will see is annexation progress reports. And in state law, there's a requirement that we go back after 6 months after an annexation is effective, and then annually thereafter until services are extended to that property to see, to report on the progress of extending services to that property. Because what state law doesn't want to have happen is that a city annexes a piece of property and then tosses the plan of services in the trash and never thinks about providing those services that it indicated that it would provide. So it's important. So the implementation of that is important. Yes, sir, Mr. Huddleston.
Matthew, would you maybe give them an example of a project or an annexation where we have not been able to provide the full services on the front end, and those services were added? And the one that comes to mind was one related to drainage and one related to fire service, where we implemented those over time.
Yeah, so the one regarding fire service, I'm thinking about the one on Cherry Lane, where there was an existing house.
Oh, before, maybe the one I was thinking about was fire flow and fire hydrant spacing was missing.
Oh, yeah.
And it was about 30 months, I think, for us to get the fire hydrants installed and the fire flow upgraded.
I don't remember that specific example, but yeah, there are, oftentimes we'll annex undeveloped land, and there's really no need to have an immediate extension of services if the land is undeveloped. But that say there's a future development at that time, that water infrastructure may be extended, but there would be no need to extend that water infrastructure upon annexation because there would be nothing to provide fire protection to. Sam, the drainage one, what was the one example you were thinking about there?
Leanna Road, city-owned property. I think we made a commitment to improve some drainage conditions in there within a certain amount of time, and we discovered during our reporting that had not been done in a timely manner, so we went back with the city services and actually improved that drainage. And the next report that came through, we could report to the council that the plan of services had been fully implemented. Normally, we'd have a plan of service 100% implemented upon annexation. Very occasionally.
And that progress report is a good opportunity for us to circle the wagons on those annexations, because sometimes things get lost in the shuffle, and we need that reminder. So it's important that state law builds in that stopgap for us, and for those instances that Mr. Huddleston mentioned. And I would say that if we are suit can be brought, and Mr. Ives may address this, but suit can actually be brought against the city if there's a property owner and we fail to provide services to that property owner. He could file suit against the city. Yes, ma'am, Jennifer.
So to be clear, the plan of services can be different on each scenario. It's not a standard, you have to provide the same services in every situation.
Right. And sewer is a good example of that, because sewer is not a service that we are required to provide to each property. So there could be an annexation that we study that sewer is just not practical. And so whereas one annexation may have easy access to sewer, and we have to plan for how we get sewer just across the street to that property, another piece of property may not have access to sewer and may never have access to sewer. And so our plan of services will state that sewer will not be extended to that property. So it's not a one size fits all, and so we evaluate each case on its own merits. So annexation is usually accompanied by a zoning request, but not always. If no specific zoning is requested, there is an interim zoning classification assigned to the property. And so an example of this is, y'all remember just this fall we had a zoning request for 2 parcels in the estates at Prim Springs to develop single-family residential lots. There was no companion zoning request because those property owners really just wanted to bring their houses in to get city services. And so our zoning ordinance, actually, it's codified that if property is zoned residential in the county, it automatically comes in as RS-15. So there's no zoning action that's required on behalf of the Planning Commission and Council in those instances. If property is zoned commercial in the county, then it comes in as CL, commercial local, if there's no companion zoning request. And likewise, if it's zoned industrial in the county, it comes in as light industrial in the city. So the order of adoption by the City Council, as required by state law, Council adopts a plan of services to be effective upon the annexation. It's a resolution to adopt that plan of services, then a resolution to actually annex the property, which would be effective upon the effective date of zoning if there's a zoning requested. And if there's no zoning requested, then it's effective immediately. And the ordinance zoning the property is effective 15 days after adoption on second reading. So if the annexation would become effective when the zoning becomes effective, which is 15 days after the date of second reading. If y'all are confused, that's fine. It confuses me sometimes too. Okay, so our zoning ordinance, which is something that y'all as Planning Commission deal with at just about every meeting that you have, whether it's via a zoning ordinance amendment or a zoning change, which is an amendment to our zoning map. So the last major rewrite of the zoning ordinance was in 1984. So our zoning ordinance today has the shell of that 1984 zoning ordinance, but we have amended it dozens of times since then. At some point, don't know when, but at some point, it'll probably be time for a complete overhaul of the zoning ordinance. That will be a major undertaking. So until that time, as we find things in the zoning ordinance that we think need to be improved upon, or that the Planning Commission or Council gives us direction to improve upon, we as staff will bring you zoning ordinance amendments consistent with those requests from the Planning Commission and City Council, where we see that there are things that need to be updated or amended. A good example of that is earlier this year we had we somewhat overhauled our section 26 of our zoning ordinance dealing with off-street parking, queuing, and loading. We made some pretty significant changes in that section. But really, when we as staff administer the zoning ordinance on a daily basis, we see firsthand things that are problematic within the zoning ordinance and things that can be improved. And so, we brought to the Planning Commission with that zoning ordinance ways where we could improve off-site parking agreements to give more flexibility to developers and property owners to be able to meet their minimum requirements. We saw where there was something new, which was over the last 5 or 10 years, more and more residential townhome developers were seeking to use their garage space to meet their minimum parking requirements. So we saw an opportunity there to create some certainty within our ordinance to which those garages could be used. And so predictability is something that our ordinance gives us, and predictability is something that we as staff like, that I think the public likes, that I think the development community likes, because it's good when you know what the end goal is, what that standard is that everybody's reaching for. So the ordinance is vetted by the Planning Commission and then adopted by council. And so before adoption, the Planning Commission must study and make a recommendation. The state law requires 15 days notice for the council public hearing, and the zoning ordinance requires reasonable notice for the Planning Commission public hearing. And so the reason we refer back to the zoning ordinance for the Planning Commission public hearing is because state law does not actually require a public hearing on rezoning requests at the Planning Commission level. That's one thing that we've always done to go above and beyond state law. And when I say we, I mean the city as a whole. That's been in our ordinance as long as I can remember, so that we give the public 2 opportunities to have formal input to the decision-making bodies. One, the Planning Commission, who makes recommendations on rezonings, and 2, the City Council, who makes the final decision. So we've always gone above and beyond and held those 2 public hearings. In many other communities, the Planning Commission does not hold a public hearing on rezoning requests. They simply study it and then vote to make a recommendation to the City Council. So the zoning includes the text of the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. Bulk zoning is still the standard. It separates incompatible uses. It dictates bulk standards, which are things such as the maximum building height, the lot coverage of buildings within each of those lots, the minimum building setbacks. All of the standards for our bulk zoning districts are written into our zoning ordinance. And so a contrast to that is planned development zoning. And so planned development zoning is really something that is for areas where it's, the bulk zoning is just, there's just a little bit too much uncertainty, or it's a very unusual circumstance. So for example, if you have a piece of property that's undeveloped, but it's surrounded by a developed area, and there is and there's a proposed use that seems like it would be a good idea, but it really does not seem reasonable to give permission for blanket permission for all the uses that could be within that particular zone. And so well, an example is one that went before the City Council just a couple weeks ago and the Planning Commission earlier this year. The Secure Lawn PCD on Gresham Lane, which is surrounded by the Lane Agri-Park property, but is directly across the street from a single-family subdivision. They wanted to do a lawn service on that property. Lawn service is the only commercial zoning district, not industrial, but the only commercial zoning district that use would be permitted in would be the commercial highway zoning district. Well, when we looked at that, we as staff looked at that, commercial highway, it really didn't seem appropriate to give blanket permissions to do anything that commercial highway would allow on that one parcel directly across Gresham Lane, a two-lane substandard road across from single-family residential uses. That just didn't seem appropriate at that location. So it was a really unusual circumstances where a planned development seemed to really fit the situation. So the zoning zoning ordinance establishes the districts that we use on our zoning map. Chart 1 in the zoning ordinance lists the permitted uses in each one of those zones. If you look at the zoning ordinance, you see that in each of those boxes in Chart 1, there's an X, an S, or a blank. If it's blank, it's not permitted. If it's an X, that means it's a permitted use by right. And if there's an S, it means it's a use allowed by special use permit from our Board of Zoning Appeals. And special uses are uses that are seen as appropriate if they meet certain standards. And so there are standards specified in our zoning ordinance that have to be met in order for the Board of Zoning Appeals to grant a special use permit. Also, there are overlay districts listed in section 24 of our zoning ordinance. And these are zoning districts that overlay the base zoning. And examples of those are the Gateway Design Overlay District, the Historic Zoning Overlay District, the Airport Overlay District, the City Core Overlay District, and the Planned Signage Overlay District. And so these either add to or take away from the base zoning regulations. But typically with each of these overlay districts, there is a statement at the beginning that says that these regulations, where they conflict with the regulations of the base zoning, the overlay district regulations supersede those regulations, or sometimes it states that the more restrictive of the two will prevail. All right, so when you look at rezoning, there are a number of factors that you look at. And in rezoning, you're looking at changing the permitted uses on a given piece of property. And so as you know, there are a number of things that you're looking for when one of these requests comes before you. Is it compatible with the general plan? And as I mentioned, the general plan is an advisory document, so the Planning Commission and the City Council do have the authority to make a decision that is not consistent with the general plan, with our current general plan, since it was adopted by the Planning Commission. Is it compatible with adjoining uses? Is it supported by the infrastructure, or will it be reasonably expected to be supported by the infrastructure in the near future? These are some of the things that you take into account when you have a rezoning before you. And you know, some of these things are subjective. What does compatible with the adjoining uses mean? That might mean one thing to one person and something entirely different to another. As you all know, reasonable minds can differ on those things. I believe Mr. Ives is back up.
How about everybody stand up and stretch for just a minute? I know you need to. Come on. Up, 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 up. Stretch. Y'all aren't asking enough questions because we're talking too much. So either you all already know all this stuff, or we're so confusing that you wouldn't have a clue what kind of question to ask. I don't know which one it is.
Yes.
Let's see. Get this going the right way this time. One thing that was mentioned, I just want to just kind of, up on the slide it said, you know, that the airport overlay was different from the airport master plan. The airport master plan is how the property within the airport is going to develop. Where we're going to build more box hangars. Where are we going to move the fuel farm to? Where are we going to build some new corporate hangars? That's the airport master plan. The airport overlay zone deals with the property outside the airport. What are the height limitations as you go? To some extent, it's directly focused on FAA regulation. The airspace over an airport is somewhat, and they call it an upside-down layer cake. So you've got a small area, and then you get a little bigger area, we can go a little higher, and then a little bigger area, and out it goes. So, but that's the airport overlay zone, has to deal with uses and heights, lighting, and some other things that are surrounding the airport, not on the airport itself. We kind of glossed over this. I had these two. I wanted to show you the difference of, we talked about subdivision plats. This plat from 1951 is not, the only thing about it is it's one I had to pull out to send to a title company for a project, but it's a relatively simple plat. Straight streets, curves, and plat notes of about 3 things. This is a more recent subdivision plat. say, go to the other side a little bit more. The layout's more complicated. The things that are shown on it is more complicated. But more important, the plat notes and commitments that are contained in this as part of the plat is substantially more complicated, substantially more involved, and substantially more detailed than we would have done in, say, for example, 1951. Just the difference of how development has occurred or is occurring today versus how it might have been occurring 60, 70 years ago. A couple of types of zoning. Spot zoning. Spot zoning, question whether it's illegal, it's immoral, everybody says you shouldn't do it. No good planner is ever going to propose a spot zone. So a spot zone is when you take one single lot or maybe two lots within an area and change the use of it or change it. So spot zoning is not supposed to be done. However, I don't know the difference between a spot zone and a planned development. And we stick small planned developments in the middle of things, I don't want to say routinely, but it's certainly not all that out of the question. Same with contract zoning and conditional zoning. Two different things there, but contract zoning is supposedly bad. You should never do contract zoning. But I guess the theory behind that is that the legislative body ought not negotiate away its powers to regulate and control the city. Now, how that's different from a planned development, I don't know. A planned development is clearly the contract zoning. The developer comes in, the city sits down with him, and they negotiate a deal. And the developer has to say how his development is going to be different from what the underlying zoning would be. And he doesn't have to go to the BZA to get variances if the terms of this planned development are approved. But it could be a lot different than what would be allowed in the underlying zone. Hopefully, we will never be in a situation where we approve a confinement hog farm in the middle of the RS-15 zone. I think there could be some objections to that regardless, but still the flexibility of a planned development is purely contract zoning. Yet it's being done. We do it a lot. I know other places. I don't know how many other cities do as much, less, or any planned developments. But I do know it's not that uncommon, and it's certainly not uncommon here. It's purely and simply contract zoning. We don't call it contract zoning, we call it planned development. The theory in contract versus conditional zoning. If the developer comes to the planning commission and says, I want to have, let me just throw out some numbers. Parking requirements are 4 spaces per 100 square feet of building. I only want to do 2 spaces. And here's why I want to do. Well, we think, all right, we'll agree to 3. All right, you've made a contract. Developer comes in and says, here's my proposal, I want to do this. Planning commission and council say, we will approve your development if we're laying down a condition. You meet it or you don't. We don't care. Here's our condition. You accept it or you don't. Somewhere there's a fine line between those two. But if you can structure it as a condition, it's in theory, it's okay. I'm only aware of one contract zoning case, and that was in Chattanooga, and there was a lot more involved, and there was some side deals and some other considerations for got zoning approved. And it was sometime after that that the legislature specifically approved contract zoning in Chattanooga, but it's not supposedly approved anywhere else. But I'm not aware, and I'm not saying there aren't any, I'm sure there are someplace, but there are none that have made a lot of big news for that. Exclusionary zoning, that's illegal. Usually that involves a use that someone thinks is unpopular, immoral, imprudent, whatever. Classic example are adult bookstores. Hundreds, probably thousands of cities and counties exclude any kind of adult bookstore, adult entertainment, X-rated entertainment from their jurisdiction. That's illegal, and when they get sued, they lose. You can put reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on adult bookstores, and you can put them on all kinds of businesses that create particular traffic hazards, particular volumes of traffic. It's not all just morals, but any kind that any business that has some offensive attributes to it, whether it's just too many cars at one time or an odor or whatever, you can put reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on that. But generally speaking, and especially if it involves any kind of claim for First Amendment freedoms, you cannot prohibit it. Our adult bookstore section, if you will, has some, it's limited to heavy industrial. There are distance requirements from churches, schools, liquor stores, a variety of other things, and distance requirements between any two businesses. That hasn't been to court. I actually went to court, but it got dismissed on another reason, got settled out on another reason, but I hope it never goes to court. Those are tough cases. They're expensive, and anyway, if it does go, I hope Roman gets it, not me. Here's your sign. We have, of course, a separate sign ordinance, but as a practical matter, it's a subset of the zoning ordinance. It's not treated that way all the time, but as a practical matter, it is. In many cities, the sign ordinance is actually a chapter in the zoning ordinance. We adopt it, we amend it, just as we would any zoning ordinance provision. Management of that is primarily by building and codes. Some discussion whether that's the right way to do it or not, but that's the way we're doing it now, and I don't think that's going to change in the near future. There are many complicated First Amendment issues when you get into the sign ordinance and signs in general. Don't think we can take the time to go into those here. We could do, if anybody's interested, we could do a whole separate program on signs. And we have a few times, but point being, it's part of the zoning and basically treated like zoning. Planning Commission and then ultimately Council, we also have created, and we put it in the sign ordinance, I mean the zoning ordinance. I'm not sure why it should be in the sign ordinance in my opinion, but I didn't write it, the plan sign overlay. And like other plan developments, it allows a large development to basically write its own sign ordinance, just like it writes its own site plan rules for a large development. That came about on the Avenue. When the Avenue was coming into Murfreesboro and they were looking at investing $100 million in our little city, and the signage that they could have had in the sign ordinance was woefully inadequate for that kind of a development. And I'll credit Susan Emerson with coming up with the idea for the plan sign overlay. And I worked on it a little bit, mostly she worked on that part. We created that system where you can come in and like a planned development, you can have special rules for signage. You got to be a certain size. I think it's 20 acres today. It started out as 50. I think we reduced it to 20. The hospital has a PSO. The Avenue, of course, does. The mall has a couple more. I'm sorry?
Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon. The sign that Amazon could have had on this half-mile long building front would have looked like a postage stamp. It would have been totally out of character. It wouldn't have. It just wouldn't have made sense. So they had to have it for that, and also because they have so many more and large traffic directional, loading zone, employees only, this and that. They had more than our sign ordinance would allow, so they have one. We have one coming through on... Yeah, Costco has one. So it helps that we can do that on a large development, that we don't have to rewrite the sign ordinance every time a new large development comes to town. Briefly on the BZA. It's authorized. I don't think we have to have a BZA, but it's authorized by state law. It's created here by our city charter and the zoning ordinance. There are 3 primary functions of the BZA. It considers special use permits, variances, and appeals from decisions of staff members that someone disagrees with. Special use permits, really all of these are administrative/judicial functions. There shouldn't be ex parte communication. I know sometimes there is. You need to avoid it to the extent possible. But a special use permit, again, there's a set of it has standards. There are standards in the zoning ordinance that say if this, this, and this, then you're entitled to do it. So BZA's job is to see, does it do this, this, and this? Not a question of whether I, as a BZA member, like it or not. If it meets these standards, it's approved. Classic example of that is Father Ryan High School up in Nashville. Nashville Metro had in their zoning ordinance certain requirements that had to be met in order to place a school in a residential district. BZA, it went before the BZA to see if it met these requirements. A number of neighbors protested, thought too much traffic, too much noise, yada-da, all the protests, and BZA denied it. It went to court, and the court said the school applicants met the standards. Metro government has made the overall decision, if it meets these standards, you can do it. It met those standards. The fact that somebody doesn't like it's irrelevant. Obviously, Metro would have taken into consideration the fact that a school is going to generate more traffic than 8 or 10 houses. So it met the standards, you have to approve it, and it was approved, and it's now where they had planned it. Variances are a little more subjective. Variances have to do with conditions of the land. The fact that it's going to cost me more to do it the way it's required than I might do it if you allowed me to do something different is not a factor for a variance. Usually it's the shape of the land, the topography, got a really steep slope. Someplace you're somewhat limited and obviously in what you can do. And it's got to not be created by the owner. So the fact that you built your house over the lot line next to you doesn't entitle you to variance. You may be able to negotiate something with your neighbor, that's up to you. Or if you build it in the setback zone, or you build it on top of a sewer line, sorry, and it's going to cost you a ton of money to fix that, but too bad. And then appeals. We don't have many of those. We have a few of them where either the planning director or the codes director makes a decision that has to do with a zoning matter, and it is appealed to the BZA. If you have taken something to the BZA and disagree with the being denied, or in fact if we as city staff and the city disagree with your request having been granted, the remedy is to go to the circuit or chancery court with what's called a writ certiorari, and that means you take the record that was made at the BZA, send it up to the other court. Very little additional evidence comes in. Mostly it's a review of the record, and I'm not sure I can say these off the top of my head, but was the decision of the BZA arbitrary? Was it beyond the power of the BZA to do? Was it capricious? And essentially, was there any reasonable basis for the BZA to do what they did? And if there is, it'll be upheld. If there's not, it gets overturned. wrap up pretty much with some, these are cities, but also state law matters. Roman, could you pass out, this should also probably be the subject of a 45-minute to an hour presentation just by itself. I'm not really addressing here the items of open meetings and public records. I'll just mention that very briefly while he's handing this out. Obviously, state law says that meetings of decision makers and of advisory committees, even if you're not the decision maker, if you're an advisory board, those meetings have to be held in the public. Unlike the legislature, which can lock up a few themselves in a back smoke-filled room and hammer out a deal, we can't do that. So there's got to be public notice, got to be open to the public. There are very limited circumstances where you can have a private attorney-client meeting for limited circumstances, but the vast majority of the city's business has to be conducted in the open. To paraphrase another work, whenever two or more of you are gathered together, there's probably an open meetings violation. Now, can you guys have lunch, chit-chat about Titans and whatever else? Absolutely. You probably shouldn't have any kind of talk about any substantive issue you're dealing with. And for sure, you shouldn't be making a deal and negotiating how you're going to vote on this matter. That's a violation of the open meetings law. The cure for the open meetings law is that you bring the topic back up again in the whole meeting and disclose, gee, we had this conversation, but now here's this and here's this, and then you make another decision on it. But the publicity and the bad press on it is still going to be there, even if you technically and legally cure that omission. So don't negotiate planning commission business except the planning commission. Now, in some ways, that's horrible as a practical matter. A lot of things can get done in a private conversation that can't get done in a public meeting. Our legislature, consistent with the actions of the federal government, have said it's more important that the government be out in the open than it be convenient for the governing bodies to get their job done. So we just need to live with that. Public records, virtually everything that comes in is a public record. Your city phone is a public record. One thing that concerns me, and it goes on a lot, is whether it's council members sending text to each other during a meeting, or staff sending emails or texts to council members or planning commission members during a meeting. That is all a public record. And if something blows up and there's litigation, your phone's going to be gone through, and all those communications are going to be discovered and they're going to be in court. To digress to the next topic, for God's sake, if you're going to do it, keep your language clean and don't say anything disparaging about the person you're talking about. Another one I'll talk about. But anyway, I would encourage everybody to not do that. I know that's going to fall on deaf ears for the most part, and I know people are going to keep doing it. But if it blows up, it's going to be incredibly embarrassing, and it could even cause some litigation that either costs the city a lot of money or could be fatal to something we're trying to get done. Get excited with my... Okay, let me... training. Maybe I'll have Matthew in a minute talk a little bit about training, but there are training requirements. Let me talk now just a bit about ethics and conflict of interest and discrimination. Those matters are all covered by federal law and state law, but they're also covered by city council or by employment handbook that is adopted by a council that is essentially a city ordinance. We don't have time to go through all this. I'm not quite sure where we're at. I think we're pushing our hour-and-a-half limit if we're not over it. I handed those out to you, and there's, I think, 4 primary things The first three have to do with conflict of interest and ethics, and the last one is the discrimination policy. I think as planning commissioners and as council members and as BZA members, there's some annual forms that y'all file. I think they've just now come out in the mail to you, and they got to come back by the end of January about what your ownership interest is in companies, whatever that might come before the BZA. I guess I would say that it'd be nice if we could just say, don't lie, cheat, or steal, and let that cover it. But gotta have a little more than that in this environment. So there are specific rules and context. I would encourage you all to look at those. Some of you may have already been through them a lot, but go through that because it's important. Maybe the number one part is there's several number ones, but one of them, if you own a significant interest in a project or a piece of land or a company that the city is going to be doing business with, you cannot participate in the decision. If someone in your family owns it, that's a direct conflict where you have an ownership interest in the project. You can't participate. Where you have an indirect interest, which means it's not direct, but that usually is somebody in the family that has something, or you have a client that has some interest. Sometimes you can still participate, but you've got to disclose that interest is there. We try to err on the side of caution when that comes up, and especially if we have a quorum without your vote on that matter, I would say generally don't vote. Announce your remote conflict. Go ahead and say, I don't think it'd make any decision, but for the appearance, I'm not going to vote or participate in the discussion of this. Kathy has done that on a number of times, but said, I'm still going to go ahead and handle the meeting, but I'm not going to participate in the discussion or vote on it. If this was something that involved Kathy's house, I would suggest that she should step aside and let the vice chair handle that meeting. But so that I think that's pretty much on that. Discrimination, don't do it. Simple rules, treat everybody nice. But I do want to say that the city's discrimination policies are much broader than federal law or state law. So if, for instance, you use a racial derogatory term to someone, that's probably a violation of federal law. It's probably not going to get a federal lawsuit against you or a judgment against you because you made one bad choice reference to someone. But it could get you disciplined in the city discipline system one time. Now, will it cause a discrimination suit against a city that has legs that can win and cost the city a bunch of money? No. But you who were there could be disciplined for it. Probably lends more to employees than to officials, but it's still with the officials too. It's still there too. And also, the categories are broader. Federal and state is race, sex, national origin, religion, not sure. I'm quite sure there's no federal protection for redheads, but if you make what would be a racially derogatory, about just about a redhead, that could get you disciplined on our city discipline system on discrimination, harassment. A little bit over. Not too bad. Matthew, you want to say just look real quick on education?
Sure.
Especially since we're coming up at the end of the year for somebody who may not have all of theirs.
Just by a show of hands, who gets tired of my emails about training opportunities? Be honest. Margaret Ann is the only honest person in this room. So state law was amended about 15 years ago to require there to be a certain amount of continuing education for planning commissioners, board of zoning appeals members, and city support staff to the Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals. And that's to ensure a level of competency and training of those individuals who are filling these roles. And so state law requires that the support staff receive 8 hours of a minimum. I say a minimum because it is a minimum. It doesn't mean that we should just stop at the bare minimum. But the minimum is 8 hours for support staff and 4 hours for Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals members. I think we're all doing great this year. Most everyone has their hours, and I appreciate y'all doing that, putting up with my emails, and taking the time to get your continuing education. I hope that you've gotten something out of some of the training opportunities that we've sent to you. I think there have been some that have been really interesting, and we've got a couple of more opportunities, one this Friday and then one next Friday. I sent the link out to you for the one this Friday to register, and the one next Friday we have not received the link out. Anyway, appreciate everybody's willingness to get that required training. It is something that, to my knowledge, in the roughly 15 years that state law has been around, we've never been audited by the state, but we are required to maintain our records of compliance to the state's training requirements for 3 years. So we have to keep those records for 3 years in the event that the state does audit us. I don't know if them auditing planning departments is actually a thing or not.
Hopefully they got bigger fish to fry, but you never know.
That's right. I guess we're.
I think that's it. Some people use an 8-ball. Some people use a variety of things. I like the Cheshire Cat. It's been one of my favorites. Questions, comments, thoughts? Hopefully this was at least a little bit helpful to everybody, a refresher for many of you, and maybe some new information for somebody.
I do have copies of the presentation if anybody would like to take one.
And autographs are available at a reasonable cost.
Do you guys record this by chance?
Audio, yes.
I would love to have it as a new oncoming member of the planning commission, so
Yeah.
I appreciate your guys' time. Definitely learn something today, but on the front end, for future folks, would be very beneficial.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I'm hoping this will be addressed, as Greg mentioned, one of the sessions will be talking about sewer capacity. So, in my mind, that the sewer capacity piece is going to facilitate future zoning, future rezoning. Are we going to be talking about that in the sewer capacity session at all?
Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about what your expectations are for the next 2 workshops?
How about these guys? They did a great job today, don't you think? Appreciate y'all coming out. Our scheduled activities for next Monday at 2 o'clock, we will talk about land use, traffic, and transportation. And then the following Monday, which is the 14th, Darren Gore will be here to talk about sewer allocation, its implications on land use and land use decisions. So that'll be our calendar. We wanted those the other way, but Darren, we had to cancel the 3 meetings earlier, and when they got rescheduled, it fell on a conflict with Darren. We'd like to have had that in the middle, and then probably buttress this with a discussion about land use and transportation. I thought it was very helpful, and as Matthew said early on, it's good for us to be reminded about the things that are important to us, and that's true in life, but it's also true for our elected and appointed officials and staff, for us to rehearse and remember, the enabling legislation and the rules and guidelines that we have. Just that refresher comes back, helps us all stay on top of what we're doing. Any other questions for these guys or other items of discussion?
And so if there are no other questions, again, thank you all for all of your time and effort putting this together for us. I know that 1 hour or hour and a half of training took hours and hours and hours of your time to put it all together, so we appreciate that and look forward to the next 2 sessions. And if there are no other questions or comments, then our meeting stands